All right. All right. I think we are live. Um, Hello, everybody. I'm joined here by Michael Liebowitz, back on the channel again. Today we're going to be debating whether politics is a legitimate branch of philosophy. Suppose you could give like a quick introduction to yourself before we get into it proper, if you want.
Well, I host a podcast called the Rational Egoist. I consider myself to be a disciple of Ayn Rand. I probably, for a while, I didn't call myself an objectivist, then I was talked into it, but I'm not really wedded to the label. I'm more concerned with the ideas than with the title. And I'm looking forward to having this discussion. It's much better than having it on X where you're typing and then you got everybody else chiming in. You
Yeah.
don't know who you're responding to.
Pardon me. But yeah, so I think this came about from I was in some manner of discussion where you asked me if my position was that politics is not a legitimate branch of philosophy. I think it was related to the open and closed objectivism thing, probably. Um, so I suppose I could give my case for why I don't think that politics is proper. If you're okay with that,
Sure.
sure. So basically, I think it is a an example of the frozen abstraction fallacy. Um, so like if we just look at how standard objectivists, Peikoff Rand would define politics. Peikoff has it that in an interview he did, what is it? Politics means what is right or wrong in terms of what the government does, what society does. Or in Opar, he says politics defines principles of a proper social system, including the proper function of government. Yada yada yada. Even Wiktionary agrees with them. This is like the standard sort of understanding of politics is, well, what should the government be doing? Um, Now, I think that it's a specific theory that there should be even be a government in the first place with certain functions, um, and they are freezing that abstraction to the broader abstraction of politics. I could give also just an indication for anybody who hasn't heard what the frozen abstraction is. It's like if I were to take some specific theory in ethics, say altruism, and define ethics in altruist terms. So to say, well, to be moral is to be altruistic. And then if somebody were to try and disagree with me, they would be like, okay, well then fine, I'm immoral then. They haven't properly integrated their view because they're still adopting this snug premise that altruism is morality. Um, so I think that's perhaps a good jumping off point. I do have other things I could say on this, but I don't want to ramble on too long.
All right. So I come at this from the point of view that there's a presumption that politics is a part of philosophy. And the reason I say a presumption because politics has been a branch of philosophy in the West going back to at least Plato, going back to 4 or 500 BC in India, 4 or 500, maybe 600 BC in China. So it's always been. So to come and say, well, it's not or should not be requires a strong case. And to me, politics naturally flows from ethics. So if you start with, say, metaphysics is about what is it that we are going to know about, right? It's what is the nature of what we're going to know? It's reality. Then epistemology says, how do we know? What's the proper method? Ethics then says, how do we behave? As in, what's the moral thing to do? And then politics says, what is the moral way or the best way to have an organized society? Now, you correctly define the frozen abstraction. And if we were saying that it's a proper branch of philosophy to discuss only how government runs, then I would say, well, you have a strong point. The problem is, even as Leonard Peikoff defines it, he says, and I'll just requote it. Politics, like ethics, is a normative branch of philosophy. Politics defines the principles of a proper social system, including the proper functions of government. So the proper function of government can be a part of it, but I don't think it necessarily has to be. I think Lysander Spooner, Benjamin Tucker, Emma Goldman, are anarchists all, but are still political philosophers. So I don't know that you have to include government in the discussion. The necessity is, how is society to be organized? And then you would make your best arguments.
Sure. So I think there is still it's how society should be organized is, I think, still implicitly collectivist. Um, it's like as if we were to zoom out and we're just looking at like the Platonic form. We're like, okay, well, how should we be organizing this abstraction, which is society? Um, Whereas it should be asking something like the way I formulate law, where it's okay, you're an individual person. How should you deal with conflicts? So it's focused on the individual level, rather than taking it up into the societal level.
Well, the entire discussion, for instance, of individual rights only comes into play because we deal with other people. It doesn't, to say how society is organized doesn't entail that there be this grand organizer who's setting things up. It only has to do with the way in which we're going to relate to one another. Even if you had a completely anarchic market where individuals were just dealing each other based on word of mouth and trust and integrity of each other, you would still have a degree of organization. It would still count as politics.
Right. But I think at least the definitions I was able to get for this, um, that type of organization they are calling government. And I think this is um, because that was the historical association that for you to have any large scale organization, you have to have a government. That can't be anarchist. And so this has been baked into the very problem statement of philosophy.
But
It's
would you, I'm sorry, go ahead. I thought you were finished.
sure, like whenever you're looking up definitions of politics, basically all of them are talking about, well, how should we be running government? How should we be running this thing? How should we be running that thing? Um, I think this is indicative that the abstraction has been frozen.
Well, of of course, I would say that if you're going to be talking politics, most people are going to associate it with government because there's never been a Rothbardian society, for instance. That doesn't mean that it preempts the entire field. Like I said, I mean, it was Lysander Spooner not a philosopher? He not doing political philosophy, or Benjamin Tucker, Emma Goldman, Peter Kropotkin. They're all, in my view. Murray Rothbard is a political philosopher. I disagree with his political conclusions, but nonetheless, he would still have to count as political philosophy, as would Marx. I mean, Marx in the end game, you ultimately have the evaporation of government altogether, and you would have basically anarchy. But Marx is still considered a political philosopher. I don't know. I mean, I'll grant you this. When you look up politics, the problem is you're going to find a variety of definitions, and that's why it's imperative that when you have these type of discussions, we define our terms. And I think Peikoff does a good job of defining it. And just doing a cursory, research this morning, or rather this afternoon, into this topic, I could see that there are a variety of ways in which they define the issue. But I don't think that government necessarily has to be entailed in it. I think social organization, and by socially, you're just talking about the way human beings interact with one another, because we're not living on a desert island. If you're on a desert island, morality certainly comes into play because you have to figure out the best way to live for yourself. But once you are interacting in groups, you now have to figure out what the best way to interact with other people is.
Sure. So I think if you want someone like Murray Rothbard or Lysander Spooner to be political philosophers, I think the sorts of definitions um, that I was talking about earlier, where it's, well, what should the government be doing? Um, they have to be thrown out, which is uh, what I was advocating for. Is we throw out those sorts of definitions and define it in terms of the individual. And the question would be, well, what questions do we have to ask with respect to individuals now that we potentially have other individuals around? And it's the main thing would be conflicts. I think things like trading and how you should trade with people, don't be a mean person to others. That all fits very squarely into ethics. I see the special part where you might need to have a whole study for it is law. It's the fact that, well, if I want to, you know, take your car and use it, but you were wanting to use it already, there's a conflict there. And how do we deal with conflicts? I think it's conflict is the important thing, which uh, brings up a whole new study. It's and I wouldn't, to be clear, I wouldn't put it as a separate branch of philosophy. I think it's just a subset of ethics. But then there is no more politics. There's no more room for it.
Okay, so that's where we can, because you would agree with me that discussing social organizations in government or how government should run, whether there should be government, you would agree that that's properly a function in philosophy.
Yeah.
Your problem is if you define politics as how to run a government, you're basically automatically excluding by definition any anarchist theorists.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't have an issue with that. I think that I'm basically in agreement with that. Now the question becomes, should there be a separate branch of philosophy to deal with social relations, social organization? And the question becomes, is that different enough from ethics to warrant its own branch?
Mhm.
And you say no.
Yeah. So like I think one reason why I would be not wanting to separate it into a different branch is because it sort of signals, at least this is the way which I've seen it signaled by others, is if you have ethics and law as just two separate things, then there becomes the problem of, well, yeah, I'm breaking the law, but I'm still doing the right thing. Um, Whereas I think there is no such a thing where you are breaking the law, obviously proper objective laws. I think there's no such a thing where you can have a virtuous crime. And that's why I'm very strong in the camp of uh, law is a subset of ethics. And then, obviously, if it's a subset, then it's not going to be a separate branch. I think just conceptually that communicates uh, different information if you're separating it um, like that.
But as an empirical fact, there's unjust laws.
Oops. So we seem to just lag out there.
Oh, sorry. As an empirical fact, there are unjust laws.
So I would say that um, those are not laws. Those are just some guy said, "Here's what we're going to do." Now he's calling it a law. It's children pretending at law, but I think it's proper law. I think law is objective.
See, that would be an example of a frozen abstraction because you're saying that only law as defined this way is law and all other forms aren't law. But that's not how the law has been conceptualized throughout history. The Hammurabi Code, for instance, would be an example of law. Moses is called the Hebrew lawgiver. That's how law has been conceptualized. So to say that we're just going to exclude everything that we have judged to be wrong, even if we're right in our judgment, that wouldn't exclude those as being laws. They would be unjust laws.
So I would agree that they are claiming them to be laws, that they are claiming them to be uh, that this is what should be done. Because if the way I would say that if you're calling something a law, what you're meaning by that is this is what should be done with respect to conflicts in this case. And now that might be you might be like a legal positivist where it's well, what should be done with conflicts in respect to this case is we look towards the legal code and whatever the legal code says, yada yada yada. So I agree that they are claiming them to be laws, but I don't think they are actually laws because I reject legal positivism in that one hypothetical.
Well, you can reject it as inaccurate or wrong. For instance, take critical race theory. I think it's a bad theory. I think critical legal theory is a bad theory, right? I think the idea of a living constitution in the United States is a bad theory. but the laws that are enacted in there, there's still the law whereby if you violate these things, you will suffer a consequence. Well, not necessarily, but if you're caught, you're subject to consequences.
Right, but the domain of law, the branch of the area of philosophy, I'll say, to not accidentally concede, um, the area that is studying is not what things can you do where you'll get consequences for it. Um, and I don't even think, like, I mean, there's plenty of things I could do where I could get consequences, but we wouldn't even think of it as being a legal issue. Like, I might be mean to you in this discussion, and then you won't want to talk to me anymore. That would be a consequence of my actions, but we wouldn't say that this is some sort of legal dispute going on. When it comes to what makes legal disputes specifically, is that it's people disagreeing over how some conflict should be resolved. It's when you get to conflicts, and sort of, I mean, I'm agreeing that these people are indeed um, making claims about that they've got certain theories of law, and those theories will say here are what the laws are. Um, but I'm disagreeing with those theories, and what that means is that I'm saying no, you're wrong about what the laws are. You're incorrect about what the laws are. So I can't say that and say, but those are still laws. They're just unjust laws. Like that isn't. That would be a sort of.
No, I get that, but it seems to me, and it seems rather obvious that you're just redefining what law is and you're changing the concept of what it's always meant since since the word and the process has been in being. The fact what makes law separate, its deciding characteristic, isn't that there's a consequence for it. I mean, that's part of the concept, but it wouldn't be that for violating. I mean, that wouldn't be the defining characteristic. But if you have a legislature, for instance, that subjects other human beings to the rules that they make, and if you violate those rules, you then suffer a penalty. You then have law. It may not be good law. There's plenty of bad law. I mean, you would have to throw out an enormous amount, for instance, of case law, common law, because the decisions are decided badly. But there's still laws. And I don't know if you look up a definition of law or you look how it was meant historically, going back to the Republic or looking at Aristotle's Politics or Cicero's discussion of natural law, or even the back with the Stoics and maybe even the Sophists before that, where they made a distinction between natural law and positive law or legislative law.
So I disagree that I'm changing the concept of what law has generally been understood to study. Um, and I'll bring this to the example of case law, common law that you brought up. I think these are um, legal systems which are built up through discovery of the law, where you have a judge and he sits down with some specific conflict and he tries to resolve that conflict. It's still conflict is the fundamental where now we're in law rather than something else. And that's what my definition of law is. It's the area of ethics which deals with conflicts. It's judge says this is what should happen here.
Yes, but in common law or case law, if you're in the United States, for instance, and you have, say, a district court rules a certain way, then the circuit court overrules that court. Then the Supreme Court upholds that. Now you have case law. That doesn't mean that they've decided correctly. Or in common law, where there's no legislation and judges are deciding, and then the law gets basically embedded based on the decisions that judges are making. That doesn't mean that they're making right decisions or they're always making good decisions judged ethically from an objective point of view, but it's still law.
So I agree that they are in the realm of law. They are doing the activity called jurisprudence, right? I agree there. Um, what I disagree with is in some circumstances they are correct that it's the law that you can't murder people. I agree. But I think sometimes they're incorrect, where they say, well, the law is that you've got to give a bunch of money to the government and you don't get any choice about it. I think that they're incorrect. That is the correct legal solution there. I think if they had, if they were better, if they had a better philosophy, they would come to a different legal stance and they would recognize that, hey, the proper law here, the correct law, what actually is the law, is actually this other thing, right? And eventually, if they did this very, very well, then they would go, well, it's the non-aggression principle all the way down. It's turtles all the way down, right?
Well, no, because turtles on all the way down is never ending. You're saying it ends at the non-aggression principle,
Sure.
but but I digress. But the problem here, right, is you're equating law with right law in the same way as somebody would equate altruism with ethics. The very statement correct law that you used before implies there can be incorrect law. And I just don't know on what basis you're saying that all law has to be objective and has to be right when it clearly isn't. I mean, what are the facts of reality that are allowing you to make that distinction? What in history is giving rise to that distinction that only those laws that are in accord with justice are actual laws, as opposed to just those are the good laws?
So, sort of in the concept of, I think when somebody says this is the law, if you're like a jurist or whatever, and you say the law on this issue is so and so, like they say taxation, maybe somebody comes along and says taxation is theft. What they're saying is that the law is that you're not allowed to steal people, even if you call it tax, even if you call it taxes. That this is an illicit thing. Um, so I'm not saying that law, the subject, refers to only the correct theory of law. I'm saying that when somebody comes along and says the law is so and so, they're making an ethical claim almost. It's like if I came up to you and said you should shoot up a bunch of heroin right now. Now, if you said no, that's not what I should do here. You're not freezing objectivism or whatever to the abstraction of ethics. You're saying no, I'm adopting a wrong theory of ethics. And when I say that the average judge who says that the tax avoider has committed a crime, when I say no, he's wrong about the law there, the law isn't that you have to give up your money to the government. I'm making an ethical claim in the same way. I'm saying that yes, he thinks that the law on this matter is that you have to give up to government, but he's wrong about that.
I know that that's what you're saying. I just don't know on what basis you're saying it because the word law, the concept of law as it is used, as it's always been used as far back as I know. I mean, the very distinction, you're obliterating the distinction between malum in se and malum prohibitum. You're saying that anything that's malum prohibitum isn't actually law. So you wouldn't then have that distinction at all. You wouldn't have any distinction between positive law and natural law. You would only have natural law as it exists or as it's embodied in statute or in legal decisions. But these distinctions are made and they refer to real things in reality.
So, somebody might have a different theory of law where they hold the contradiction that, well, some law comes from that guy said so, and some law comes from, well, it's just in nature. You know, like if you're a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, you probably hold this contradiction. You'd say, well, no, yes, of course, plenty of laws come from the government said so, but not the laws about murdering people. That those ones are special. Um, so I'm not saying that they are not doing law there. They are in the field of law. They are asserting some certain legal theory. But I am from my perspective identifying that as a blatant contradiction and saying, well, their legal theory is clearly incredibly wrong, not because law means natural law, but or law means positive law, um, but because um, law is dealing with conflicts, and I think the correct way to deal with conflicts is the non-aggression principle.
Right. You're saying that's the correct theory of law. but they have a theory of law. And if they, for instance, were to get elected to the United States Senate, the House, or in the executive, were enacting their theory, they would be passing laws. They would be bad laws, but they would be laws nonetheless. Otherwise,
So
otherwise, it's hard for me to understand how would they even be doing philosophy of law or jurisprudence if their laws aren't actually laws.
so they are claiming that they're passing laws, like how I might be claiming that I am issuing the correct ethical stance and everything. Maybe I'm like some sort of a mystic or whatever, and I think ethics comes from my decrees, because I'm Jesus or whatever. Um, and I might be claiming that I'm issuing these various commandments or ethical edicts, and it says like, oh, everybody should wear a funny hat every Tuesday, and I'm claiming that I am issuing an ethical commandment. But you might come along and say, well, no, that's not actually an ethical commandment, because there's no such thing as an ethical commandment, because ethics is objective, not intrinsic, right?
What I would say is that that's your theory of ethics. I would say that you're wrong, but you're still putting forth ethical principles, principles of ethics. You're just mistaken. Well, in that case, badly so. But if you have an elected body that has the force of the state behind them that can enforce what they're saying, and they've enacted rules, those are laws. They're bad. There's a lot of bad laws. The entire war on drugs, for instance, is made up of bad law. Tax law is bad law, but it's law. It's just bad. It's not based on a proper understanding of ethics.
Sure. So I think there might have been, um, I think I've identified the misunderstanding here. So I would agree that, in some sense, if you asked me to identify, well, this wear hats every Tuesday, is that an ethical commandment? I would say, yes, that is an ethical commandment. Um, but in a different sort of context, if I asked you, well, hey, should I have to wear a funny hat every Tuesday? You'd say, no, you don't have to do that. And that's the sense in which I'm saying.
Yeah,
I'm saying like, well, if somebody came up to me and said, well, should I have to give all my money to the government? I would say, no, you don't. You shouldn't have to be doing that.
right. And the use of the imperative there is key. The imperative should. Should I have to? No. But if I don't, I'm going to face a consequence. It's still a law. The thing that you would say is that should not be law. You should not suffer a legal penalty for not obeying their edicts.
Well, to be clear, I don't think whether you end up suffering the consequence for it or not is relevant, because I could be, right now in this discussion, I might assert the non-aggression principle over and over again. I am asserting laws, and you would identify, okay, he's what he's saying there is a law. It's a type of proposition, and we call that type of proposition a law, right?
Well, yeah, but there has to be if for a law to have any effect, there has to be the possibility of consequence. Otherwise, who cares? It doesn't mean you necessarily will face the consequence, and it doesn't even necessarily mean or it doesn't mean that's the fundamental of law. I mean, I've broken who knows how many laws in my life when I was a teenager and didn't get caught for it, so I faced no consequence. I was still breaking the law, but one of the elements that are involved here is had I been caught, I would have faced a consequence, a penalty, whether it be a fine or probation, prison sentence, community service, whatever.
Right. So I don't think it's fundamental to law at all that we have this. Well, if somebody is able to bring you to justice, then they're going to bring you to justice, because, like, of course, you know, if I was if I woke up tomorrow and I had Superman's powers and I was able to bring to justice all of the horrible communists who do horrible things, um, then yeah, I would be able to bring them to justice. But I think they're still violating the laws that I assert, even if I'm not able to bring them to justice. I don't think that is necessary for it to be that this type of statement is called a law. It's like in ethics, you might it might be the case that like you could do something bad and you do it really secretly, so nobody finds out about it, and maybe you don't lose any reputation over it or whatever. Um, you're still going to find that you get some sorts of consequences because reality will push back against you. Reality is going to avenge itself if you're like, say, you know, evading left, right, and center or whatever it is. And I think the same thing is true in law, and that's why it's a subset of ethics. If you're breaking the law, you're not going to live a good life.
But there has to be, in order for a law to have any effect, a potential consequence. If there's not, then who cares? What difference does it make to me what laws you pass? Not you in particular. I mean, a government or an anarchic community, wherever. If there's no consequence to breaking the law, then I don't care. I mean,
Right?
whatever.
You're assuming a certain sort of consequence, namely that I'll be able to come over with a bunch of billy clubs and like throw you in a cage or
No, 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 no. I'm saying there has to be a potential for the community, whatever amount of people are being governed by this law, right? If it's five of us in an anarchic community, there has to be something. Maybe I have to pay a fine. Maybe I have to do a prison term. Maybe I have to wash your car. But there has to be the potential for consequence of violating the enacted law. Otherwise, that law is meaningless. It's who cares?
well, is that the same in other areas of ethics? Does there have to be some sort of consequence for me evading? Consequence in the terms of
Yes,
somebody's going to punish me.
there has to be the potential. And what I mean by that is this: if you violate ethical principles, right, I might be able to lie to you and get away with it, and there'd be no consequence at all. But we know that in principle, I'm acting against my interest by being dishonest, meaning there's this very real potential that I have a negative impact on myself by engaging in that behavior without the idea of acting in my own self-interest, meaning having productive consequences for engaging in a behavior, or negative consequences would be the unethical if it's a negative for myself, then you wouldn't need ethics. The whole reason you need ethics is because there's good and bad consequences to your actions. It doesn't mean you're always going to suffer the bad consequences. It just means that you're acting in such a way as to raise the probability that you're going to suffer such a consequence.
Sure, and I think the same sort of consequences, potential consequences, are true of law. Like even if it's just you and me on the desert island, where let's say you would be able to overcome any attack I might do against you. So you don't want to fight or whatever, um, and you maybe secretly start stealing things out of my hut, and maybe I don't notice or whatever. I think that it is, even if I couldn't, cage you up or force you to do something, even if I couldn't overwhelm you with force, there is still potential for bad consequences for you in the future. I think you shouldn't be engaging in those crimes because maybe I find out and I'm producing all of the things you want, and I'm just like, well, screw you. Atlas Shrugged washed up on the island last week, so I'm going to stop now. And then suddenly you've lost any sort of trading relationship you might be able to get, right?
Yeah, I could suffer a consequence in that way, but it wouldn't be a legal consequence. And that's why, well, one of the reasons anyway, that politics and law, because it becomes a separate subset. Because in the type of situation you're talking about, I'm behaving in a certain way, and then there's a reaction, whether it be from the environment or maybe one isolated individual that I'm dealing with. But in law, that it's a different thing because you have now a group of people that have enacted a law, and you have that same group of people or somebody at their behest who's going to enforce the law. You have human beings that are putting themselves on the side of this law to basically force its consequences in a way that doesn't, it does happen naturally, just not in the same way because you don't necessarily have human beings that have to do it. For instance, if I steal from you and you did, now you're not going to trade for me, that might be a natural consequence, but you're not coming and punishing me directly. You're just withdrawing from me. It's
Right.
not it's not the same sort of dynamic that happens when you break laws.
And that's sort of what I was getting at. I don't think that the type of consequences you have to suffer for a given statement to be a law for us to identify a given statement to be that's a law. Um, I don't think the type of consequence has to be me and my friends will come over and force you into some punishment. I don't think that is included in the concept, because if I mean, this is just based on the way I define law. It's the area of ethics which deals with conflicts. Nowhere in that does it say that, well, you've got to have somebody coming along and forcing this person into some sort of punishment. Like, so from where do you get this idea that there has to be what you deem legal consequences for it to be
Where I
a
get
legal
it,
statement?
because, well, first, your definition of law, I don't know that that's actually the definition of law. You kind of tipped your hand by saying my definition. I don't have it in front of me right now. Unfortunately, my phone is downstairs charging, so I can't just go look up the definition of law. But even if I could, and even if it was exactly what you just said, that doesn't equate the concept with the definition. And the concept of law, going back to antiquity, always had a consequence for the violation. That's involved in the very conceptualization of what is taking place, that there is a consequence to it. And it doesn't need to be in the definition of the word.
Well, is that not freezing the abstraction? Because, I mean, there are certain jurists, certain legal theorists, who think that punishment theory isn't a valid area of law. They think there is no such thing. I mean, I think these people are crazy. I think that there is such a thing as punishment theory. I think you can punish people for breaking laws, but we shouldn't freeze the abstraction of law has to also have punishment theory.
No, 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 no. What I'm saying to you is that in order for law to be effective, there has to be a consequence. Call it punishment. It doesn't really, I mean, is a fine a punishment? Is community service a punishment? I don't know. But if there is no consequence, then law has no effect. I mean, who cares if you can pass all the laws you want? Then what they would be at that point is recommendations.
So, I mean, we're not pragmatists, right? The whether or not something is a law, uh, and whether or not it's true that it's a law or false that it's law or whatever, um, we don't care if it's effective. We don't care if people actually obey these commandments. We don't care in the case of my commandment that you have to wear a funny hat every Tuesday. Um, we don't care whether that commandment, this ethical commandment, is effective. It still can be identified as an ethical commandment.
No, we absolutely ought to care.
Well,
No,
you
no,
care
we're
whether or
not.
not you should follow it,
Well, no,
right?
no. But what I'm saying is that the entire point of ethics and the entire point of law is based on the effects that it's actually going to have on our lives. That's not pragmatism, because we're doing it by reference to principle. If we're doing it correctly, we're saying that we hold these principles because these principles, living by them, is what is good for
Sure, sure.
us.
I,
Right.
I'm
So the consequences are definitely a part of it. To just say, well, intrinsically this is bad, so that's all that's necessary, that wouldn't work. I mean, what I mean by work is that wouldn't be a part of, and we've kind of switched the discussion specifically to objectivism. But in objectivism, no, the consequences absolutely matter.
so sure. I agree they matter in terms of should I follow this um, ethical edict that I should wear a hat every Tuesday. Sure, the consequences definitely matter there, whether or not it's correct or not. I'm saying if we're just on the level of identifying whether this is an ethical commandment or not, whether this is an ethical statement or not, we don't care what the consequences of it would be. We just care
Of
what type of statement, what the form of the statement.
I don't follow what you mean by the consequences. Are you saying the consequences of uttering the statement or the consequences of the ethical principle we're elucidating?
So I'm saying the consequences of following or not following the hat principle. Um, that matters for whether it's a correct ethical principle or not, um, but not for whether it's an ethical
Oh,
principle or
okay.
not.
Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. So you're saying that it can be an ethical. Okay, I was misunderstanding you.
Mhm.
Sure, but you're not legislating now for other people. That's why ethics in law, while law is a derivative of ethics, it's not the same thing. Law has to do with how communities are governed. What are the rules that people in these communities are expected to follow, and what will happen if they don't? If you just have somebody that's like, even let's say if you take law, you mentioned that there's people who think punishment is wrong. Now, what is the word? There's a word for this that I can't remember now. Not retributionists. They are. I wish I could remember, but I can't. But there's a theory in law basically that says that what you're going to do is you're going to bring victim and the victimizer together and have them talk things out, and it'll be much better that way. It'll spur rehabilitation and make everybody whole, that sort of thing. That might be a theory of law, but there's still a consequence. If you break the law, now you have to go and engage in this sort of discussion with the victim, right?
Right, but we can identify it as a theory of law.
Sure, but there's also something that happens when you violate the law, that the government or the agency or whomever has the power to make you engage in this. If they don't have that power, then the law, it's pointless. It's a recommendation. It doesn't. That's why people will say this has the force of law, because if you don't follow the law, something happens to you. You have to do something, and there has to be an element of force. If there's not, then the law is pointless. I mean, I don't know if you properly could even call it a law. It's baseless.
Sure, but I think this is freezing the abstraction, because there are some people
Well,
who
let's
think,
be clear though.
well,
I mean, at some point, in order for a concept to be a concept, it can't just include everything,
right, I
right?
agree, but you're including too few things. So you are beforehand just getting rid of any legal theory which wouldn't have any theory of punishment, right? But it's still saying something about
Well, it
how to
depends
deal
what
with
you mean by
conflict.
it depends what you mean here by punishment. Right? Because are you talking about retribution? Are you talking about prison sentences? Like there's a variety of different things
Sure, these
that
would
can
all
serve
be
as
sorts of
punishment.
punishments.
What I'm saying is that when you conceptualize law, there's a consequence for the person that violates that law that is implemented by the lawgiver.
Yeah,
And
that
if
would be the
you,
punishment.
yeah, but if you don't have that consequence, then it's a pointless law. I mean, I don't know. I haven't honestly given it enough thought to think if you could even properly call it law, but I have given it enough thought to know that that law would be meaningless. It would have no
So,
backing behind it.
but you're then saying that it's meaningless because people wouldn't bother to follow it.
I'm
But
saying
that's
that
not the standard of meaning.
I'm saying a lot of well, actually, if you're talking about a system of justice, a system of law, then yes, it does matter. It matters very much so. Otherwise, there's no point in even enacting it. If people aren't going to follow it, then why even enact it? What would be the point? The point of enacting laws is to govern a community in a certain way, to get people to do things in a certain way. That's why you have Moses giving commandments, because he wants people to act in a certain way. And then there's punishments laid out for people who don't obey him.
Right, but whether or not something is a theory on what the law is.
Can you do me a favor real quickly and just tell me, because you have a computer and I don't know how to do it on mine, and tell me how Blackstone defines law?
Um, a rule of civil conduct prescribed by the supreme power in a state, commanding what is right and prohibiting what is wrong. So that's clearly relying on statism, or at least the theory that there should be a state.
Sure, sure. Well, I mean, that would make sense because you're talking about Blackstone, you're talking the 1700s. So that would make sense that he would define it that way. But I think that the key there is what it's prescribed and prohibited. And my point only is if you say Liquid Zulu can no longer comb his hair the way he does, he has to now get his hair cut in a mohawk. But then you don't do it, and there's nobody even yells at you for not doing it. Then what force does that law have? What is the point?
Well, presumably, the person saying it is claiming that I'm doing something wrong or unjust, right? And I mean, like I've said this to many people, and many people agree with my legal theory and have stopped doing aggressive things because they're like, okay, yeah, I agree with your argument that this is a wrong thing to do, even though I'm not able to physically force them to do these things, because obviously the philosophy of the day is horrible. Um, whether I'm not, I'm able to force people to obey what I think the correct laws are, doesn't matter for whether we can identify them as laws.
It seems to me that what you're talking about there are ethical principles, that this is what you should and shouldn't do ethically.
Well, yeah, every
But
hot tub, every
but
jacuzzi is a hot tub.
no, but yeah, but no, well, all laws have ethical implications. Not all ethical principles have legal are a force
Right,
of
right. Yeah.
law or legal principles. It's the two are not the same. They're not
I'm saying
co-equal.
it's a subset relationship. I'm saying every
Sure.
law is an ethical principle.
Sure. Now,
Not every ethical principle is a
if
law.
you're advising people, for instance, don't initiate aggression, right? You shouldn't, if you want to behave ethically, don't initiate aggression. That would be an ethical principle. Now, if you say, as a community, if you initiate aggression, we're going to boot you out. You're going to be ostracized. Now you have a law that's being followed, or at least a rule. I don't know necessarily that rule becomes a law unless it's legislated. I don't know. That's beyond my understanding right now. But you would have a rule and then you'd have a consequence. What you're talking about is giving people ethical advice and then they're following it. There's no community organized that's subject to that law. There's no consequence for not adhering to it. So I don't believe that that follows law. That's just an ethical principle.
So I think what you're doing is you are asserting the theory of legal positivism, at least as stated by the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is, I'm just going to take like a narrow definition of it here, which is that, because I don't have the exact definition up, but I remember it for the most part. It's that law depends on social facts and not its merits. So you're saying that, well, it's not actually a law until people get in a community together and they could enforce it. But then that is freezing the abstraction of,
No,
you're taking legal
because
positivism and saying that's what law
no,
is.
I'm not. Because legal positivism, from what I understand it as, is the view that there's no correct principles by which you can enact law. That whatever the legislature happens to do, that's the only law that can be relied on. I do think that there's a natural law, but when you say natural law, you're qualifying the term law by definition. You're putting a qualifier ahead of it. And I think that in order for it to be correct, legislated law ought to be in line with the natural law or be based on natural rights principles, right? But even if they're not based on natural rights principles, it's still law. Like you understand what I'm saying? But in a legal system, or in a legal organization, in order for something to have law, there has to be consequence. Natural law is, like I said, that's natural law. That's not what we've been talking about here.
Sure, but then you're still saying for something to actually be a law, for a law to actually exist, well, that depends on consequences,
No,
which is
what I'm saying is, in order for a law to have any meaning or any impact,
meaning,
yeah,
right?
by that I mean that there would be 0 point in legislating a law for which there was no consequence. That's what I mean by meaning. It would be
But
nothing. It would
what
not matter.
consequence in what mean? Because I think there are consequences of
No, no, I'm
publishing my
saying
legal
no,
philosophy,
no.
for
I'm
instance.
saying what I'm saying is a consequence that's implemented or inflicted by the governing body,
Yeah,
not a
but
natural
then law does
consequence.
depend on social facts.
Well,
That is
well,
the legal positivist
well,
thesis.
hold on. No, but law by necessity, it rights is dependent on social facts. Of course, you don't have these things. Don't even arise
That is the legal
outside.
positivist thesis.
Well, that no, because legal positivism is a lot more. I understand that when you just look at the definition, yes, but legal positivism entails that there is no correct way to enact laws, that there is no correct theory, or rather, there is no objectively right laws. It's just whatever happens to be enacted. I understand that, but just looking at the definition doesn't say that,
But
but that's what legal positivism is. But outside of social relations, there's no need for laws. There's no need for even the concept of rights doesn't even arise outside of social groups.
so, I mean, can I just read for you from John Austin, English jurist who is purported, at least by the SEP, to be a legal positivist? The existence of law is one thing, its merit and demerit another. Whether it be or not, whether it be or these early English writers are horrible. Whether
I
it
know.
be or be not is one inquiry. Whether it be or be not comfortable to an assumed standard is a different inquiry. So he's at least saying that yes, law it might have certain merits or demerits, but whether it actually exists, that depends on social facts.
Right. The problem is you're quoting a guy, I don't know when he wrote that, who's
1790 to
yeah,
1859,
yeah, and it's one quote
1832.
that I don't know the context. I just know that legal positivism is based on the idea that there is no natural law. That's what I know. So you can have legislation that's based on natural law, and that legislation would still have to take place in a social realm, but it would be based on natural law. Whereas legal positivism also has to take place in a social realm, like all law in this context does, but it's not based on anything outside of itself or outside the arbitrary will of the legislator.
But okay, so what would be the meaning of a natural law for you if you think that for something to be a law, there has to be consequences in the specific term you're using?
What I would say is that natural laws, for instance, I would equate, or I don't know if equate's the right word here, but what things am I justified in prohibiting other people to do where I would then have the right to use force against them? So, for instance, if you are in our group and you're not initiating force against anybody, you're not stealing from anybody, nobody then has the right to compel you to do anything, to give them your money, to pay for our defense, nothing. You don't have to do anything. Now, if you come to me and steal my stuff, now I have the absolute right to retaliate, and anybody within my community would have the right to use force against you to prevent you from initiating force against another. Those are natural rights, natural law, and that's what ought to be codified in a legal system, whether it be through common law or through legislation.
Right, but then you are agreeing that there's a certain type of law, namely a natural law, where we can still identify it as a law. We can still identify that claim. Perhaps if I punch you, you're allowed to punch me back, or whatever. We're still able to identify that as a law, a natural law to be sure,
Sure.
um, without you actually being able to punch me back. Without you actually
Right.
being able to use force
Right.
against
Yes.
and
But
carry the
remember,
punishment.
but here's the thing. We started the discussion, right? Is whether politics should be a part of philosophy. And then after coming to some agreement on that, we morphed into law. So we're talking about laws that actually govern societies. Natural law is a different topic, and I mean it's a worthy topic. It's just that the way that we've been using law wasn't talking about natural law. We're talking about things that are enacted by people. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been an extension of the political discussion we were having earlier. When you're talking about politics, you're talking about how groups of people are interacting.
Okay, so maybe there was miscommunication there. I don't think we are on a different topic. The way I was reading the discussion was that you were interrogating my theory of law as a replacement for politics as it currently stands, because I get rid of politics and put law in its place instead. Um, so it's not about how people actually do end up interacting. It's about how should people interact, and that's the question that law is supposed to answer. Law is supposed to tell you how people should interact, specifically with respect to conflicts.
Well, I don't know. I don't disagree that politics, the whole topic, is about discussing how people should interact in groups. But there's different theories, and there's still political theories, even if I think they're wrong. And a law, whether I think it's right or not, if it's enacted, it's still a law. It doesn't matter if I agree with it. It just matters if it's been, oh, sorry, if it's been enacted. And then I would say, in my view, there has to be some enforcement mechanism of the law, or it doesn't have the force of law. It's just empty. It's a suggestion.
Okay, so is a natural law not a law?
It's natural law is a different concept. I mean, it's a variation on the concept of law, certainly, but it's not the type of law that we've been discussing up until now, the law that is
Uh,
enacted and governs communities. That's what I've been talking about.
well, I'm asking about law in general, because I
Well,
want to
for
know what
instance,
it means to say
well,
that something is a law.
for instance, I mean, it depends on the context you're using it. Newton's laws of mechanics. I mean, Newton's laws of motion,
In
for
terms of
instance.
jurisprudence.
If you're talking about jurisprudence, then if you were to say, well, what is natural law? And I would say by natural law are the types of rules or the type of laws that ought to govern a society. They're the things that are discoverable by reason. That if we're using our minds and we're studying society, and by society I just mean groups of people, different people interacting with each other in a given geographic area or whatever, however much you want to extend it out, but in a given area that they're interacting. And then we discover how they ought to be governed. And then you would say, should they be governed, for instance, by a republic, by a democracy, by anarchism, by what's the word that they have where they have the agreements, community agreements? I can't remember Hoppe's word for it, but I'm sure
Um, Covenants.
covenants. Yeah, if you should be governed by that, that would be the proper scope of political philosophy. And then and I think you and I would both come to the same conclusions when it comes to natural, what's been called natural law or natural rights or individual rights, on what these rights actually are, right? Then we would have to go on and discuss how are they best implemented, how are they best protected, what type of system would best keep these things so that people are safe. And then we could say, if your group, say we're in an anarchic society, and they say these are the rules for the community, those will be laws. Or if you have a republic and they pass them, these will be the laws. But then people are expected to obey these, and if they don't, they suffer some consequences for disobeying them, whether it be maybe just they're thrown out of the community. That we're not going to allow you to live amongst us if you're going to behave this way. That would still be a consequence. You have to leave.
So it seems like the terms as you're using them are when you're saying, okay, well, these are the laws, you're using, well, that's the laws as they actually are implemented in some society or whatever. Whereas this thing is a natural law, this is the laws that should be implemented.
Yes.
I think this is strange, conceptually speaking. Why
Okay.
would a natural law, why would that not just be a type of law which is natural? Why is it that this isn't a subset of things which are laws? Like if I was talking about a man, like man, we know what that means, but that there isn't a separate concept disconnected from this, which is white man. White man is a subset of man, right? So why
Okay.
is natural law not a certain type of law?
I think it is. I think natural law are the type
Okay,
of
so if
policies that
natural
should be
law,
enacted. If all our disagreement here is about is if natural law it can still be a subset of law without there necessarily being a consequence, then I have no problem. I would agree with that. I'm talking about the laws that actually govern communities. In order for them to have the force of law, then that community has to be able to give a penalty for it of some sort. And I'm also saying that something would be a law whether it was in conformity with natural law or not.
okay, so then if I think we are in agreement then that there's this broader category called law, and those laws might be certain things which were enacted by the Nazis or actual natural laws, and there's all sorts of different claims in here which we call laws. That's
Sure.
if somebody says something, yada yada yada. Now, what I'm saying is the way we identify whether a given claim is a law is whether it's telling you what should happen with respect to a conflict. And then that's how I get to my definition.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I haven't given it a whole lot of thought. I've read this idea that conflict is a necessary aspect, and I think that when it comes to I think what I've read actually is that politics is all about how to deal with conflicts, and I don't necessarily agree that that's true. But law, I think, does in large respect, or maybe it doesn't, but it ought to deal with how human beings deal with each other when conflicts arise. I don't have an issue with that. Not off the top of my head. It doesn't mean if I go and think about it later, I might not come to a different conclusion. I'm just saying that your formulation there, that law is properly how we govern conflicts, sounds good to me.
Sure. So then,
So I don't have an issue with that. But the modifier there is properly. Just because something's not proper doesn't mean it isn't law. It means it's not good law.
okay, so I don't think that modifier is necessary. So I would agree that, um, you know, let's just take the bump stock ban to piss off any Trump supporters who've got 2016. Let's just take Trump's bump stock
And
ban.
let's make it clear that Trump's the one that banned bump stocks.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I would agree that that claim that you're not allowed to use bump stocks anymore, that is a law. It is a legal claim.
Yeah.
But if somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, what does the law say about am I allowed to make bump stocks?" I would say, "Yeah, you're allowed to make bump stocks if you want," because they're asking me my opinion on what the law is, right? So I think I agree that it's an improper law, that is not actually the law, but it is a law, right? It is a legal claim, but
Yeah.
it's not the law. Because when I say the law, I'm saying sort of the correct stance on what the law is on this topic.
Sure. Now here's the thing, right? I think I agree with your meaning. What I disagree with is just the way you phrase it. And here's an example of why. Suppose somebody came to you and said, according to the law, can I make a bump stock? And you say, yeah, go ahead. It's fine. Then they do it and get arrested because they've now broken the law. So now, if you're talking about somebody that is specifically your student, say they're taking your course, and you know what they're really asking you is this proper within the legal code that you've developed? Right? If
Hmm.
that's what you know they're asking when they say the law, if that's shorthand for the legal code that you've developed, or according to your reasoning, you've discovered the proper legal code, right? If that's what the person's asking and you know it, that would be okay. But if speaking specifically and on point, you would have to say, if the person asked you that, you would say, well, it is the law of the land that you're operating in, and as such, you'll suffer consequence, but it's not proper law, or it's not good law, or it's not in line with the correct law.
So I don't think that people consistently adopt that sort of standard for
I don't think
what.
people
Hold on.
consistently do much of anything.
I don't think. I don't think. I think exceedingly few. I have never met someone who consistently adopts the standard of I should say I should add the asterisk. Well, it's the law of the land, yada yada yada. And one way we could imagine this is maybe I'm in a seedy bar and I say, "Well, what does the law say? Would it be legal for me to uh, tell that guy that I'm going to have sex with his mother?" It's like, well, yes, of course it's legal. But if I go up to this seedy guy in the seedy bar and say I'm going to have sex with your mother, I'm going to face consequences for that. I'm going to get beaten,
Yes,
right?
by that individual, but not by the legislation
But
or the
then
legislative
that's
body.
reifying the government as something
No,
special,
because it
which
doesn't
has
have to
this
be,
thing
but
called
it doesn't,
legislation.
but it doesn't have to be a government. Whoever's governing your community,
Well,
whoever
this
is
guy is governing the CD bar.
he is, and that would be a very poor choice on his part on a individual basis, and it'd be an unethical thing to do. But now, if he faced, say, arrest or excommunication, or being ostracized, or a fine, or some such thing that was done in a legal format, where, say, he's given due process, or some other such thing, then it would be a law. They're two different things.
But hold on, what makes that the law, but not the law of the CD bar? Why do I care about the law of the United States,
well,
but not the
well,
law of the CD
well, hold
bar?
on. Well, it might be the law of the CD bar, but law requires some sort of codification, whether it be done through what's the word I'm looking for here? Judicial decisions, judicial fiat, legislation, whatever. It, you, You have to know the law. Now you might have, now you could also, I suppose, have, you would call it the unwritten law, right? You'd say the unwritten law of the CD bar. And I suppose that would be okay, in common parlance. I think that would be fine. I don't really have an issue with it. I mean, we're here having a philosophical discussion. You're right. Most people don't communicate that way. But I would say if you ever have a conversation with Stefan Kinsella, then he's going to absolutely insist that every word is used precisely. And I'm okay with that. And I'm also okay with, just having a freelance discussion as long as we know that that's what we're doing. And I'm okay. Like, I don't mind if somebody comes to you and says the law and they know what you're talking about within it, doesn't really matter. But it matters in philosophical discourse that we have some sort of precision and that we figure these things out. And how is law used? How is it? Maybe it's used metaphorically, as in the case of the law of the bar, or maybe it's used actually, very literally, as what is the law that actually governs this area or this place, this community.
Sure. So I think we're basically in agreement on this topic, but I just want to clarify that what I was sort of trying to indicate, the problem I was trying to indicate with, well, I've got to specify, I've got to change my language on, well, Trump said no bump stocks, is that, there could be however many various different groups and, gangs who are going to punish me for various different things. Like maybe I'm not, maybe it's not against the law for me to piss off like a local councillor, but he might really make my life horrible for doing
Sure,
that. Like,
sure.
it might be like, have you seen a Cape Fear or something?
I
Where,
haven't, but I
yeah,
should.
oh, it's a great movie. Like, some guy like gets pissed off with his lawyer, and he starts like harassing his family and goes really really far with it. Like, maybe it's not against the law for me to piss this guy off, but he might really make my life miserable
Sure.
for doing it. So I'm getting some sort of consequence from that. So properly speaking, that is a sort of law. Um, but why don't I have to clarify all these asterisks for all these different things? Why do I have to just clarify it for the government?
Well,
I
I
think it's
think,
because it's
well, no,
reifying the government in
no,
some
it's
way.
not. No, I think that we should use clear language again, unless it's understood that we're just discoursing. And even then, I mean, to be honest, I like to be clear in my communications. I don't like to be misunderstood, even by people that I'm friendly with, right? So it, in that case, it's, you're talking about somebody just coming. I guess I'm just trying to think this through. Just because you suffer a consequence doesn't make it law. But if there's law, there has to be a consequence to violating it in order for it to have any kind of force. That's basically what I'm saying. And you're right. I mean, ultimately, you and I are agree on many things in here. We both have the same intellectual forebears in large part, so it would make sense. And and what else can we do but nitpick and disagree over small things? Otherwise, it wouldn't be very much fun.
I'm interested in this claim that facing specifically a sort of consequence where it's somebody coming over and punishing you, yada yada yada, um, where facing that sort of consequence doesn't imply that you violated a law, but having a law implies that you face that sort of consequence. I'm curious about that claim. Why is it not an if and only if? Why is it not every
Well,
time you face a consequence
consider
then you
this. Did you
violate a
see?
law?
Did you see Mike Tyson's? I mean, Mike Tyson smacked Jake Paul in the face.
Yeah.
Jake Paul stepped on Mike Tyson's foot. He smacked him in the face. It's not against the law to step on Mike Tyson's foot in a boxing square off like that. He still suffered a consequence nonetheless. It's not against the law, for instance, to walk down the street in a bad neighborhood, but you walk down that street at night in that bad neighborhood, you might get mugged. And it has nothing to do with law. It might just be somebody wants your money. So they mug you.
But then what is the meaning of the general term law, where it might be a natural law, or it might be some other thing, yada yada yada? Like, what does the general term? What
That's
does
a
it
good
mean to
question.
say this thing's a law?
That's a good question. And if I were to say, I would, law, I think, has to do with the rules that govern human societies, right? Now, when you say natural law, I think you throw in I don't know if it warrants an entirely different concept than law. I'm not sure. I haven't done an abundance of thinking on the subject. But natural law is the discoverable law that ought to govern human societies. And so there's, I don't know if natural law properly is just a subset of a broader concept law or if it warrants its own separate concept completely. I haven't, like I said, I haven't thought about it in detail, but I do know that there's a difference between natural law and enacted law. And
I mean,
ideally, they sync.
mhm. So I mean, but is the bad neighborhood not governed by the rule, don't walk along here with a bunch of gold chains and a fancy watch and everything?
I don't think it could it's so arbitrary and on the spur of the moment, I don't know that it could properly be called law. I mean, I'll give you an example. I did a mugging when I was 14. And we were walking down one side of the street. The kid I was with saw somebody he didn't like on the other side of the street. He said, "Hey, I don't like that kid. Let's go take his chain." So we went and beat him up and took his chain. Now, what law could possibly that kid be violating? He's just walking down the street and got jumped completely at our arbitrary whim because we happened to see him at that moment. I mean, there was an abundance of things going on. My friend wanted the chain. He didn't like the kid. I wanted to fit in with my new friends, so I went along. But that's not law. That I'm very confident of. I think that you could probably raise an abundance of hypotheticals where it's not clear whether is it law, is it custom, you know, there and it would become difficult. You know, how many people does it need to be for it to be a law? Does it need to govern a given community or just a given body of people who maybe live in separate areas that aren't contiguous, but they've all agreed? And in that, I don't know. I can't.
Mhm.
I'm not going to pretend to answer that sort of thing because I don't know. It's an
Sure.
interesting, it's a very interesting path to take to think about the topic, though. I'll give you that. I think I think you raised some interesting questions.
Mhm. Yeah, so I won't pester you with endless hypotheticals then.
No. It's
Uh,
I don't like unrealistic hypotheticals, right? I don't like when in the course of a debate somebody brings up the trolley problem because I'm never ever in my life going to be in a situation where I have to throw the switch on a trolley to decide whether I'm going to kill one person or 1,000 people, right? So I'm not, don't give me something that's never going to happen as the basis for how I should live my life. Because first of all, you have to set so many factors ahead of time, right? Why are the 5,000 lives necessarily worth more than one? Who are these 5,000 people? Are they 5,000 murderers on death row and this one person's an innocent 6 year old? There's so many things that are involved there that make it, you know, just an irrelevant thing. But if you're trying to decide the finer points of law and you say, well, what if it's a community of 12 people and they're interacting only over the web, for instance? Are those laws? Those are can be interesting discussions. Trolley problems, lifeboat problems,
mhm.
no.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we have any more ground to cover at the moment. I mean,
No,
we could.
can I just say something to you before we go? I just found out you're only 23 years old. I didn't
Mhm.
know that, and it wasn't based on your looks. It was based on how you debate. And I'm just letting me say, for
Thank you.
23 years old, I am very, very impressed in a way that I wasn't when I thought you were 40. Right? Right? To be 23 years old and interested in ideas to the degree that you are and formulating these different ideas into your own philosophy, keep going, brother. I'm very, very, very impressed.
Thank
Very,
you. I appreciate it.
very good path that you're on, man. And it's something that should be praised. Even though I disagree with you on a number of things, it's irrelevant.
Mhm.
You're on a great, great path, man, and that's good. I commend you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. I
All
suppose
right.
I'll see you next time.
Yeah, we will. We'll definitely do it again.
Yep. See ya.
Take care.